Okay, you are about to be live in, sorry, one second. And now.
Welcome, welcome. We'll give people a couple of minutes to hop on and get started. I know it takes a minute to connect on Facebook Live. Thank y'all again for being here today. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. Okay, well, I think it is straight up 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and start, or at least on my clock, that's what it says. Thank you to the 4 or 3 of you joining me on Zoom, and thank you to all of you on Facebook watching this webinar today. This week is National Law Enforcement Week, honoring our nation's law enforcement and remembering those who have lost their life in the line of duty. Last year, Texas led the nation in on-duty officer deaths. We know that officers are dispatched to a variety of calls, whether it's a traffic incident or burglaries or people in need. But a study released by the Department of Justice last year shows that domestic disputes can be the most critical. In fact, it says that 40% of the fatal calls in those years of the study, which was 2010 to 2016, were related to calls to domestic violence. So today I have with me 3 officers from various parts of the county in different roles within their department, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Chief Dixon, will you start us off?
Certainly. Thank you for having me today, Lori. My name is Frank Dixon. I'm the Chief of Police for the Denton Police Department. I've been here about be 2 years in October, and I just love the partnership working with our other partner agencies in North Texas and with the fine folks at Denton County Friends of the Family.
Lieutenant Bruce?
My name is Lieutenant Bruce. I am investigator CID for Aubrey PD. I've been here since 2005, and I appreciate being asked, invited to do this. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Sergeant Baker?
Yes, I'm Brian Baker. I'm with the Colony Police Department. I've been here for 14 years, a little over 20 years in law enforcement altogether. I'm the sergeant over the Criminal Investigations Division. So thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, today during our conversation, I hope to highlight the dangers of domestic violence, not only to the victims that are suffering at the hands of those who believe they have the right and the privilege to assert power and control over another, but also to those who respond to the call when those calls are made from people in need. So those of us who are watching today on Facebook Live, please feel free to comment in the comments any questions that you have for these 3. I have some questions that I'll be asking them, and then when we're done, we'll field questions from the community. I have friends of the family staff assisting me with that, so please comment away. Sergeant Baker, I'll start with you. I just shared a fact that 40% of the fatal calls to law enforcement were related to responding to domestic violence. What makes responding to a domestic violence call so dangerous?
Well, Lori, there's quite a few factors that go into it, and quite a few, I think, different things. Of the most part, it's like that the situation's already emotionally charged between the people involved for the things that led up to, say, the argument and then ultimately the violence. So when we get there, the scene's already kind of an angry scene or angry location. And sometimes when we show up, it can, or most times it'll enhance or make things worse because it's their home. They don't want us there quite often, or at least one of the people don't want us there getting involved in their lives, and it can escalate. So, but then on top of that, it is their home, and within every home are various weapons that can be used against law enforcement. From obviously you have your kitchen knives that I know of of a sheriff up in Oklahoma was attacked with a kitchen knife during a family violence call back in the 90s. There's, of course, any firearms. You know, it is Texas, so there's generally firearms in the home. But then anything around the house can be used as a weapon, from the kids' baseball bats to, you know, just other household items can be used. So you're talking about a situation that is already emotionally charged, and then just the sheer volume of potential weapons within the home that can then be used against the officers makes it for a very dangerous situation.
Lieutenant Bruce or Chief Dixon, do y'all have anything that you'd like to add to that to express the level of volatility of these calls?
He did a good job.
You look at this year, we've lost over 70 officers in the line of duty, 18 of those by use of firearm. And in a span of about a month, we lost 4 officers nationwide responding specifically to DV calls. And they range in age and experience from, you know, Commander Greg Carnicle in Phoenix. He was about to retire 2 months from the time he was killed. He had 30 years of service. And then you go to Brianna Leith in Indianapolis, she had 3 years of service on her department. So, there, you know, it really doesn't discriminate like most crimes don't, right? The danger faces all of us, no matter, they don't care about what rank you are, what stature you are when you come there. This is very emotionally charged situation.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Sergeant Baker, you talked about Texas being well known for their firearms. Texas is a firearms state known for having guns in the home, the right to carry a weapon, and then also for our love of alcohol. I know during this pandemic that Texas has allowed delivery of alcohol through Grubhub or any of those. And Lieutenant Bruce, does that access to guns, alcohol, maybe even substance use impact domestic violence or the volatility of that?
Yeah, undoubtedly. First of all, alcohol and narcotics alter the state of mind, and inhibitions are lowered. When we're talking about family violence, though, what we are talking about at its core is power and control, because the end game is control. Power is used to gain and keep control. And so in terms of alcohol, it will lower the inhibitions of not only the actor, but the victim as well, because the victim may change their behavior, which will cause a reaction from the batterer. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword when you're talking about alcohol and drugs, narcotics. But again, the end game is control, and that's what drives this aggressor, this batterer, is the need to control. And so when we talk about firearms, even in brandishing a firearm, raises the lethality factor. When we factor in different things that allow us to get a lethality score to determine, you know, where this thing has been and where it's going. The fact that firearms are used or referenced raises that. Understanding that the end game, though, is control. In most instances, a firearm, when used, will be used more for control, more for fear, because since the end game is control, when the actor loses his victim, he loses control altogether. So it becomes a final solution, as it were. And that's why we know in law enforcement that the most dangerous time for the victim is when there is the fear in her aggressor that it's coming to an end. Maybe it's divorce papers are served, maybe it's an arrest warrant or whatever it is. That's when the issue of firearms or any other weapon, even the batterer's hands, become of real danger to the victim.
I see. Sergeant Baker, Chief Dixon, anything that you would like to add to that piece?
I'll tell you what, one of the things I think, if I remember right from that study that you talked about earlier, in the 40%, talking about related to guns, and the 40% of the officers that were killed in line of duty were at domestic violence scenes. I believe in that same study, they showed that the majority of those officers were killed before they even got to the home, as far as being out there outside of the home. And I believe all but one of them were with a firearm. So, yeah, firearms are extremely dangerous, of course, with our victims. But then as soon as a firearm, like Lieutenant Bruce is saying, when a firearm has been introduced into that situation, it becomes even more so deadly because of its presence when we begin to arrive.
Chief Dixon, Lieutenant Bruce talked about a lethality score, and I know that the city of Denton uses a lethality assessment whenever they respond to domestic violence scenes. As the leader of the biggest police department in our county, what are some of the policies that you've implemented related to domestic violence?
So outside of that, I've looked at just our response in general. So I've mandated that officers write a report anytime they respond to a DV-related call, whether that be verbal or physical. If there's no violence, typically, you don't see those as being serious, quote unquote. But I'll tell you, the documentation really comes into play later on, because you see a lot of times in these calls a progression. And then you talk about the cursory crimes that are kind of tied to DV, whether it's graffiti, criminal mischief, criminal trespass, stalking is a big one. If we're not properly documenting those on the front end, when it comes time for us to prepare a case for court or for a magistrate to look at when they're setting bond amounts, we're not going to be prepared, and we're really not doing any justice for the survivor who we're ultimately trying to help and protect, right? Another thing that we have done is we have implemented where we bring stakeholders in and survivors in to sit on selection boards for detectives, specifically when they're going to the family violence unit or the sex crimes unit, because I want a survivor to sit across the table and ask our police officers who are going to be detectives investigating these crimes, how are you going to personally respond to me if I'm a victim in that house? I want to know where your heart is. Are you really invested in this job, or are you doing it just to get on day shift and to have weekends off? And that's extremely important to me. So we're constantly looking at creative ways on improving our response to the community. And those are just a couple of what we've implemented so far.
Awesome. You talked about having a survivor or stakeholders present in those meetings. And many of the people watching on Facebook, I would imagine, are wondering, like, if these situations are so volatile, if these situations are so dangerous, then why are victims staying in those situations? I've heard in my tenure many times, how come they didn't just leave? So Sergeant Baker, in your experience, what are some of the reasons that you've experienced that victims would stay in a home that's so dangerous?
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I first, in 2012 is when I became a detective and started investigating some of these cases. And I shared some of the same frustrations that I think a lot of people shared, because out of my own, I guess, ignorance is really what it was. I didn't understand some of the dynamics of those abusive relationships. But what I've seen over the years is that from fear that things will be worse, or fear that there will be more violence if I try to leave, and oftentimes when a victim does try to leave is when it will become some of the more violent or more violent times is at that moment, like Lieutenant Bruce was saying. So much of family violence is about power and control, and when a victim wants to leave and the actor starts to see that he's losing that power, losing his control, that it will become the most violent in order to try to gain that back. But besides that, there's oftentimes there's a very much of a financial dependence that the victim has. You know, most people are multiple income families. If I'm going to leave, then I'm going to lose that part of my income. And here in Denton County, specifically, there's not a whole lot of, say, lower income places that people can go. If one of the things I was told not too long ago was, you know, most of our apartment complexes around here require you to make 3 times the rent. So if my income is supposed to be 3 times the rent per month, but then I leave my spouse or my significant other and I've lost half my income, I'm not going to meet that anymore. So now I'll be homeless. And if I have kids with that person, that becomes even more of a problem, because now I may be, you know, making my kids homeless without a place to go. And so we could definitely use some more help around that here in the county. But so for fear, you know, your financial or other resource dependency, children, you know, I mean, who wants to really take their kids away from, you know, another parent? Because, you know, what got you together in the first place is probably love. I don't want to sound sappy today, but, you know, in the end, there's something that got y'all together. So people may think, you know, this may be something that's going to turn around. If I just stay long enough, maybe he will quit abusing me. Unfortunately, that's typically not the case, but love is a thing. And then, of course, then there's between on the lower ends, I've seen some religious or some cultural issues where people stayed because of their convictions, their personal beliefs that they can't leave. And then met the people who believe that this is just the way things are. You know, I grew up in not me personally, but I've heard them say that they grew up in abusive homes. So they just kind of learned that that's just how all relationships were. So when they were abused, you know, as adults, it was just more of more normalcy for them. So there's a lot of reasons why people would stay. And once I kind of got my eyes open to that, it helped me to connect more with our victims, so that there was maybe that little bit of, geez, I can't believe you're still with this guy. I got that attitude out of the way, and I was able to be more effective, and in turn help everybody else around us, you know, to share that information. So sorry, a lot of words for just a handful of things, but
Yeah,
yes.
I think that's a really good explanation, because if you don't put yourself into their shoes, and if you can't experience that level of empathy, then it's easy to say, oh, just leave, just get out, just walk away. But there are so many nuances and pieces that keep people together. Chief Dixon or Lieutenant Bruce, do you have anything to add to that from your experience and other reasons why victims might choose to stay or feel they need to stay?
Well, just to kind of build on what Sergeant Baker said, a lot of the victims, especially female victims, don't even realize that they are a victim. They believe that if they were just a better spouse, if they just didn't do things that made their spouse angry, if they could just change things about themselves. And believe it or not, I have worked with a lot of victims who believe that they're the problem. They believe that it's their fault, and you know, look for ways to change themselves, not realizing that that there's nothing they can do because it isn't about them.
Mm-hmm. Chief, anything to add to that?
No, I think they hit on everything. You can't discount the, you know, the family shame that some of these survivors feel. You know, they'll get from their parents, you know, why do you want to leave them? Do you really want to separate your kids from their dad? And then one thing that we don't talk about often enough is the male survivors that are in these situations. You want to talk about feeling of being inadequate. You're going to have people talking about, you know, what kind of man are you? You're letting this lady beat you and you're afraid to leave. Come on. So, I mean, it's a very complex issue that I don't think people take a lot of time to think about. And when you're thinking through why don't they leave, think about the high functioning people that you know that are in bad relationships that don't even include violence, and they hesitate to leave. It's a huge decision. So, you know, judging people on based on what you would do personally, and, you know, unfortunately it happens.
Right. So Lieutenant Bruce, whenever law enforcement is on scene, and we've talked about how volatile these situations can be, what can law enforcement do on scene to to support the victims of domestic violence?
Well, the first responder is also has the opportunity to be the first healer. And by that, I mean that when the first responder, when the first officer on the scene actually, they've got to sort things out, they've got to calm things down, they've got to make a safe environment. But once they reach that point, and they begin to speak with the victim, there are a lot of things that come into play that may not be obvious to the casual observer. Things like facial expression. If you look at your complainant and you are giving a look that says, "I don't believe you," or anything that's other than supportive, that just that much can lose the victim not only as a witness, but can really retard the healing process. Body language. Where are your hands? What are you looking at? Do you appear to be distracted? These may seem like small things, but they aren't. They're very important. Empathy. A good officer has empathy. A good officer can offer that feeling that they know, maybe not how you feel, but how it feels to hurt. And hurt is hurt. And so there's a lot of things that are done that need to be done by the responding officer. And then things like being sure to get a good report, get good information. How does that help heal? Well, the less times that we have to go back and make the victim revisit this by asking more questions, the more likely they are to begin a healing process. In terms of what we can do after, there are also a lot of things. One of the first things that I do is try to get my victim to contact friends of the family. And because I know that that's where they're going to get help with their protective order, they're going to get help with victims' compensation. If they need a safe place to go, friends of the family is going to help them find that place to go. There's a number of things that we do. The protective order is very important in terms of ensuring safety and that feeling of safety that victim needs, not only for herself, but should she have children, or himself, or should he have children. So whomever the victim is, we have to be supportive and understanding and so many other things. We don't just show up and say, tell me what happened. Okay, thanks. Have a good day. We have to offer not only verbally and in writing support, but in our looks, in the tone of our voice, and in so many other things. And then, of course, we give the state mandated informational brochures that also help victims understand what's taking place, what's going to be next, how they can get a hold of the investigator that's going to be working the case, and all of those things, because those things are important for the victim to begin to feel safe. And they're not going to begin to heal in any other way until they feel safe. And so we have to help them to feel safe.
I agree completely. Sergeant Baker, Chief Dixon, anything that you would like to add to that? Of being on scene?
I think men and women in law enforcement across the country, they do an amazing job, paying for food and clothing out of their own pocket on scene. If they need to find some place to stay, like Lieutenant Bruce was saying, and they don't have the means of facilitating it directly, they'll go and get that hotel out of their own pocket as well. And then directing them the resources if they're not from the area or they're looking to go to another area, whether it's, Genesis in Dallas or Safe Haven in Fort Worth or anywhere in between, is doing those things, because those things really count on the back end once they're out of that situation.
I agree. I think that there are so many opportunities for positive law enforcement promotion. I can't think of the right words that we miss out on, that officers oftentimes don't do that for the recognition. They do that out of the goodness that's within them. And that's why they got into the job in the first place, is to, many may say, to, investigate or arrest people or go get the bad guys or whatever it may be, but it's really out of the goodness of their heart that they want to help the community. At least that's been my experience. And I know a coworker of mine has said that one of the biggest pieces is for officers on scene to say that they're worried, they're concerned about the safety of the victim, and that they're there to help them, that they see how volatile and how dangerous the situation is, and that it might open their eyes, just like you were saying earlier, Lieutenant Bruce, about they may not know that what they're experiencing is a crime, or that they're even a victim in the first place. So Chief Dixon, I know earlier you talked about the relationship with Friends of the Family, and I know that Denton PD and Friends of the Family work very closely together. We are truly blessed by that relationship. And I know over the last few years, we've created a domestic violence high-risk team, DVHRT. What does that DVHRT team do, and what is the impact to the community in Denton?
Well, more than just teaming up with Denton County Friends of the Family, it's really a collaborative, multi-jurisdictional approach that brings holistic resources together when you're talking about the police, prosecutors, probation and parole, even battery intervention training, counseling, short-term, long-term. It's really a collaborative effort that I think sets us up as a community, and this is Denton County-wide, to really show some steps of success and how can we bridge the gap between delivering good service, protecting people, and getting them the help they need, but most importantly, holding those offenders accountable for their actions. And there's a number of ways that I think collaborating in that manner gets that done.
I agree completely. I think that when we look at a multidisciplinary team or multidisciplinary approach, that there's perspectives and life experiences that are shared that can be aha moments for other people in the room, and perspectives that they may not have even considered. Lieutenant Bruce and Sergeant Baker, when it comes to those collaborative pieces, what are y'all doing individually in your communities, if anything, to help guide your domestic violence or family violence investigations, or just increasing in training or what have you?
Well, for us, one of the things that we try to do, we've, of course, over the last couple of years have been trying to really foster and improve on that relationship with Friends of the Family. The victims advocates, the counselors, of course, and of course, legal reps, and all the help that we've been able to get in understanding more from the victim's perspective and the questions that they need moving forward have given us other ideas as far as how we can better serve them on our end. But besides that, some of the things that we have done is also then reaching out to other law enforcement agencies and trying to find out, some of, like with Denton PD and of course with Aubrey and some others, is where we try to find out, well, what are you doing in these particular situations so that we can try to be better? Because that's what, in the end, that's what every one of us want to be, is we want to be better at our jobs so we can be better for our communities and better for our victims. And just staying within my own bubble, I'm not going to get any better. So getting out and reaching out, talking to the various agencies and working with them and just opening up those lines of communication so that we can just foster that relationship has been just a tremendous help, I think, to us, and has improved us tremendously. I'm not sure if Chief Dixon knows or not, but we absolutely stole their lethality assessment so we could use it in our cases. And we've in turn shared it with other agencies that we've talked with that have learned about it. And of course, I know everybody else is kind of doing their own thing too, but we want to be better. Denton was leading the way and doing a really good job with it. So we started trying to copy a lot of what they were doing. And in turn, it really has helped us, and it helps with our prosecutions as well.
Awesome. Lieutenant Bruce, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, yeah, the importance of collaboration can't possibly be overstated. It's important in every way, not only like Sergeant Baker said, if you stay in your own bubble, you don't get better. And it's also about resources. He knows things. Chief Dixon knows things I've never known. And so by reaching out to them or whomever that, has the information is vital. But thinking that I can do that is the key to it. Because if I don't believe that I'm going to have anybody that's interested in me reaching out to them, then I'm not going to. The friends that I've made, the contacts, what have you, that I've made, both with Children's Advocacy Center of Denton County and Friends of the Family, being part of the MDT at CACDC, has given me avenues that I can reach out, and has been enormously helpful so many times. So I appreciate any opportunity to be allowed to be part of a group or collaborative.
Part of the conversations that have been happening over the last couple of weeks have been in relation to the isolating factors of this pandemic. That we had the shelter in place, don't go anywhere, and I know that we have lots of questions from the community that I'm going to get to here in just a minute. But one of the things that I've seen on Facebook and social media in general is that there's been a huge increase in family violence during this pandemic, and I would like to hear straight from the source, from the three of you. Is that accurate? Or are there more calls, and does that equal more arrests or more offenses being filed, or is it that there's more calls but perhaps offenses are less? Sergeant Baker, do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. I can't speak for, of course, anybody else but for us. But so, unfortunately for us, our domestic violence cases were already trending up beginning back in last year. So as far as the pandemic goes, they didn't increase, and our lethality is getting a little bit worse. And so we're still trying to study and trying to find out what that is and how we can better intervene to try to limit what's going on. But as far as the stay-at-home order goes, so we were trending up in family violence cases as it was, but our calls for service, overall number of calls dropped considerably, yet our domestic violence calls didn't drop. So whereas we weren't responding to nearly as many other calls, we were still responding to that same trend going up of domestic violence cases. So it was weird for us here in the colony. Our regular caseloads went down, but the domestic violence stayed the same, or we're still on the trending up aspect of it. So it's kind of, I think, odd how I didn't anticipate it working that direction.
Right. How about you, Lieutenant?
We've seen an increase in family violence, domestic violence cases. We've seen an increase in more of an increase in calls for the first responders than what actually turns out to be a case, but both of them have trended up.
What creates that disparity for those that don't understand the difference between a call and a case and an offense? What is that disparity?
So sometimes well, let me say it's not unusual for the officers to get a call about a complainant, a situation going on in a home. They show up, it's all verbal. Somebody got scared, somebody called the police. Nobody has assaulted anybody. Once they make that, they realize that and they sort things out, then they will make suggestions about how to prevent anything further. So it's very frequently it's a verbal altercation where people get mad, somebody gets scared, and they call the police.
I see.
And it's important that we respond to those. Yeah.
Right, and that wouldn't necessarily become an offense or anything like that. That's
right. There's no offense.
As a whole. Gotcha.
And, it can. They may decide that not only was it verbal, but there were threats that were credible threats, and then that may turn it into an offense. But very frequently, it's just a verbal situation.
I understand. And Chief Dixon, this is the kind of cases that or calls that you were talking about documenting anyway, even though it's not an offense, it's still being documented by your officers. How about Denton PD in their experience with increase or decrease recently?
You know, early on in the stay-at-home order, we were kind of the anomaly. Ours started kind of trending down. And I can tell you the last 3 weeks, we have gone up 60% more calls, DV-related calls, than the same time last year. So I think as the stay-at-home order elongates, people are spending every waking minute in their home. They're homeschooling kids. People are starting to get laid off and furloughed, and you're looking at the economic impacts. So in these households that already have violence occurring, now it's being exacerbated by all these other causations. So we're hopeful. We're going to put out some very targeted messaging in the next day or so to make sure that our survivors know that we're here to help protect you. But more importantly, a pointed message to those that would commit these acts and let them know that we're going to come at you. We're going to put you in jail. And we're going to try to get you the best case presented as possible to hold you accountable for your actions.
I'm like, woohoo! Chief, you talked about a 60% increase in your calls. Does that also correlate over to offenses, or is that an increase in call but a steady trending up in offenses that are becoming cases, or something different?
Yeah, we haven't had quite the same number of cases coming out of those, but you know, I say that 60% increase is the same whether a crime has been committed this time or not, an actual offense, because it's almost like a preparatory offense, for lack of a better term. It's, they haven't gotten to the point of committing an offense, but they're working up to it.
That makes sense to me. I mentioned that we have lots of community questions, and so I will ask the question, and then if you're interested in answering or being the first to jump on, if you'll just give me some kind of sign so that we don't talk over each other, I would appreciate that. So the first one is this is actually from one of our friends of the family counselors that's watching. She says that when she talks with clients about calling the police when they need to, what can she share with her client to help keep an officer safe when they respond? What can someone in the community do, or a victim that is calling the police do, to help make the scene safer? Go ahead, Lieutenant.
Well, finding out, you know, what is in the home in terms of weapons is always important. It's one of the things that dispatch asks a caller is, are there any weapons in the home? And then try to identify what kind of weapons, any information that can be given about the actor, the batterer, is helpful, especially name and date of birth, because then we can run them ahead of time, find out what their history is, and you know, do they have a history of violence? Find out the address so we can run a location check and see how many times officers have responded to that residence and what for. Information is our best friend.
I see. Sergeant Baker or Chief Dixon, anything that you would like to add to that for members of the community?
No, I think Lieutenant Bruce put it pretty well. Information is a huge help, and whatever it is that can be, because we know it's obviously a volatile situation. So, you know, trying to be separate, get away is sometimes what causes more problems. So just whatever information we can get is very, very helpful.
Thank you. The next question is about the strengths that these victims or survivors have in these relationships. We talked about why they may stay and what's going on in their homes. What strengths do you see in your experience that women who are victims of domestic violence what strengths do they have themselves?
I'm sorry, are you saying strengths?
Yes.
As in strength? Okay.
What personal strengths do they have? And I think from my perspective, I know the question is more for y'all, from a law enforcement perspective. But, you know, when you look at the level of violence and you look at all the dynamics in family violence, we talked about those who stay because of the children in their home. It may actually be that being in that relationship and knowing that it's going to escalate if they leave is the highest level of safety for their children. That's staying and trying to be as protective of their children as they can might actually be what keeps their children alive and themselves alive. So that strength in knowing what is best for them and their children, I think has been incredibly eye-opening for me in my tenure here at Friends of the Family. Anything along those lines that y'all would like to share, or any other experiences like that?
Well, I think to your point, they showed a tremendous amount of courage and resilience. If you can only imagine getting up every morning and not knowing what you're going to do to spark a violent outburst by the person that you love, I cannot imagine, you know, what's going through their minds each and every day. You're constantly planning. Am I going to break a rule, a house rule today that's going to get me in trouble? And yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Lori. And you know, people look at someone that they believe to be a victim of that, and they shake their head sometimes and talk about how, you know, they're weak they are, and boy, if that was me, I would do this or I would do that. But the truth is, sometimes, you know, the stronger thing to do, it's not the safest, it's not what I would recommend, but in that victim's mind, their only solution to making sure her children are safe might be, without any other knowledge or help, that's what I've got to do. I've got to endure this for the sake of my children. And that takes incredible strength.
I agree. You know, Chief, you said something that reminded me of a story a survivor was telling me, in that they wake up, or she had this experience of waking up each day and wondering what that's going to be like. What will this day bring? Having that element of fear of the unknown every day. And as a complete outsider, I am not in law enforcement at all, but I believe that y'all walk into your jobs every day with the same level. You walk into your space each day with a fear of what might happen today while I am on duty, what might happen. And I think that in some ways, that sense might create a higher level of empathy for y'all, that you recognize the dangers that are in front of you and can place yourself in that same space of a victim in domestic violence, wondering what dangers are ahead for her. So I think that there's some definite correlation there. The next community question is, have any of the three of you in your experience seen an abusive relationship where they broke up and then got back together and the abuse stopped once and for all? Is that even a possibility?
Yeah, Lori, I think I might have seen that one or two times in my career where it's stopped for good. But so is it possible as part of the question? Sure, it's possible. But I've not seen that. Personally, I've not seen that very often, very, very, very rarely in my career that no abuse occurred afterwards. It's just not what I've seen or experienced myself.
I see. Lieutenant Bruce or Chief Dixon, anything to add to that?
I've never seen that scenario. Not ever.
Gotcha. Chief, were you about to say something?
No, I was just agreeing. No, it's definitely the exception, not the rule.
The next question from the community is, what training opportunities do you as or within your police departments provide to officers around domestic violence? Chief, maybe you should start with this one.
Okay. So in the last couple of years, we've really focused on being more victim-centered, trauma-informed department. So we've partnered with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, has brought just a number of great trainings, but I'll tell you probably the most significant one was strangulation. I can tell you that immediately following the first strangulation class we had successfully filed 5 cases in the first 24 hours following that class.
Wow.
And they were put together very well because of the things that our officers learned during that class. We have now expanded that. We have brought in Denton Fire Rescue. We have talked to them about looking for signs of strangulation on scenes, and it has actually helped them as well. So we're going to keep expanding that. We're going to try to get into the local hospitals to bring more awareness to it, because what people don't understand is when you're the victim of a strangulation case, the outward signs of it probably won't present themselves immediately. So unless you have a UV light source or you take some extensive x-rays or CTs, you probably won't see some of the telltale signs of that.
I see. The benefit to having the EMTs trained in strangulation, what does that look like?
So, many times people that have suffered from a strangulation crime, they'll say, well, I don't have a shortness of breath. I don't have, I feel fine. I was strangled. I might have even been unconscious, but I don't want to go to the hospital. What they don't know is there may be something else going on medically that's not presenting itself. And when it presents, it presents very rapidly. You can become in a life-threatening altered state very quickly if you don't go get checked out. So we're really trying to push for people to get transported to the hospital, get thoroughly evaluated, make sure everything's okay before you get released and go back into your home.
I see. And Sergeant Baker, what have you done at your PD, or what training did you receive, and what training are you ensuring your officers receive?
Well, some of the stuff, especially when I was a crimes against persons detective, I got to go to some of these other classes and stuff that kept going forward, that like the strangulation classes that Chief Dixon was mentioning. Been able to go to those, and those are very much eye-opening in the things that, you like to think that you know a lot, but then it doesn't take much sometimes to show you just how little we do know about a certain topic, and how, you can have a fatality strangulation without having much visible injury. So they're we've been able to do that. Thankfully, Denton is a large agency that has opened up a lot of their trainings to outside agencies as well, because we're not as big as they are, and we've been able to send some of our officers to some of those same trainings that they've hosted for us. We've been sending our detectives, of course, to some stalking trainings, sending them to strangulation trainings as well. And then here at our department, we have a annual in-service training that's week-long that each officer has to go through. And domestic violence and strangulation is now part of that training, so that the patrol officer who's responding has more opportunities to learn some of the same things that we've got to learn through our careers and through our experiences. So it's just allowing us to share that knowledge, maybe not as fast as we would like, but we now have these opportunities to do so.
Mm-hmm. Lieutenant Bruce, I know that at one time you were a trainer for SafeVic. Can you speak to what SafeVic stands for and how that is utilized in the state of Texas?
So SafeVic is the sexual assault family violence course that basically is taught to first responders as well as investigators for best practices in investigating this particular crime, both sexual assault and family violence. So it covers a range of things. I think it's a really good program. I was an instructor for, several years. And it's a good primer for anybody who is going to be dealing with these types of crimes.
Is that a requirement for officers in the state to attend that?
I don't believe it's a requirement, but I do believe it is, and Chief Dixon would know much better than I. And in fact, I'm going to defer to him.
Okay. Pass.
It's not a state requirement yet, but I can see it moving in that direction, like most everything else that comes up.
I remember being in a meeting, since we're on this training piece, about just the process of law enforcement, that when an officer is hired on at a police department, they go through the academy, and then they are usually placed in deep night patrol. And that the number of family violence calls is the highest on that shift. And so that the officers that are on duty when those calls are the highest are actually the ones with the least amount of experience. And that was a oh gosh moment for me. Is that do you experience that to be reality, or do you feel like they get enough education through their field training to cover the response to that? This is a bit pointed question.
I can speak for us here that it is true that we do have a lot of junior officers working at night. But one of the biggest resources we have in our department is one of our night shift commanders, who's a lieutenant now, was a sergeant in our family violence unit when we implemented all of the things that we're talking about. So he took a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge to the night shift to help cultivate those young officers as they're learning best responses and how to do their jobs. And so we have a lot of people that work at night that really take these to heart, cases, DV cases, and they do a tremendous job at preparing them.
Yeah, I agree with you that ability to take a high level of experience and move that piece into supervision is a great move for all PDs, I believe. Sergeant Baker, Lieutenant Bruce, anything you'd like to speak to on that before I move to the next question?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, so we have all of our new hires during their FTO or their field training phases, one of their phases is that they come to criminal investigations and they spend some time with us. So we're able to work with them from the detective side or the investigator side and really start to explain to them, hey, these are the things that you're looking for. And sometimes they come to us in the right phase where they've already got to experience some of it on patrol, and then we can explain it to them. This is what you were seeing, or maybe this is what you missed. Other times we're giving them the information ahead of time, and then they go back to patrol, and then they can experience it with now maybe a knowledge piece that's been implemented. So we try to help them out that way. We do our best to keep that open communication between the night shift supervisors and myself and my lieutenant, so that when they do have or an issue or something maybe that went wrong, we can speak freely amongst each other and say, hey, this is what I saw the other day in this officer's investigation, and this is how it could be better. Or the same way, it's, hey, this officer did a great job. You need to go commend him because I forgot to tell him that, a month ago, but he was smart enough and used it, did it on his own. So we have the in-service piece, so we can talk to them about investigations, but then at the same time, we send them through the investigations division during their FTO process.
Gotcha. So I got a 10-minute warning, if y'all can believe we've been on here for almost an hour, and I have about the same number of questions. So I'm going to do a little bit of rapid fire if y'all don't mind. Next question is, what can everyday citizens do to best support law enforcement?
Get involved in their Citizens Police Academy if you have one in your local jurisdiction. Speak out at inside your city government, whether it's helping us or holding us accountable, because we want to continue to grow and get better. Like Sergeant Baker said, this is all about getting better, right? So do that. If you can volunteer at your police departments, do that. Or just when you see an officer driving down the street, wave at them and tell them thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Chief. The next one, what mental health resources do you have in place for your officers to deal with vicarious trauma and burnout so that they're able to continue to respond to DV calls with empathy and understanding? That's a good community question.
All right. So we have an employee assistance program that the officers can use on certain situations. Like not too long ago, I was working nights. I was a patrol supervisor, and we had an infant death. And I was able to then recommend, knowing that we have this free resource in place at our city, I can direct the officers over and the dispatchers for that matter, to the employee assistance program, where they get, some free counseling services as well. So that's what our city does. It is offers basically free counseling for it. And then we try to encourage all of our people to utilize it. And then we try to ask all of our supervisors and our peers to look out for one another. And if we think that somebody looks like they may need to have it, we just talk to them. So
open communication for sure. And I know Chief Dixon, I believe Sergeant Jones is very active in your peer support. What does that piece look like?
So we do have a great peer support team here that Sergeant Jones heads up. Whenever we have a critical incident, we'll have a critical incident debrief, and it'll be like a peer-to-peer debrief of sorts. And whether we use our own peer team or we cross over with the fire department and with the Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas and at Sam Houston State, sometimes we'll bring them in to help as well. So we're doing a number of things to try to look out for the overall well-being of our officers.
Awesome. What are your independent department policies on making CPS reports when there's calls to domestic violence and there are children present in the home? Are you making CPS reports on every one of them, or only if necessary, or something entirely different?
Yeah, so our officers are required to make a report anytime a child is present in the home where there's domestic violence. As professional reporters, we're required to do that anyway. So,
gotcha. Sergeant Baker, I saw a head nod from you. Is that the same in your department?
Yes, ma'am, it is. So it's a requirement. If there are kids at home, we're calling CPS to let them know.
Gotcha. Okay. So next question, what happens with victims of domestic violence when a case has been filed and an arrest has occurred? What's the next steps for the victim?
well, if I can jump in, what I highly recommend they do is, first of all, actively seek a permanent protective order. Stay in touch with the investigator, or if it's been turned over to the district attorney already, stay in touch with their investigator. Try to limit your access on social media. Just generally things to make sure that you stay safe are all things that I recommend to victims.
Gotcha. Chief, Sergeant, anything you'd like to add to that? What about from an investigator standpoint in staying in communication with the victim? I know they might be connected to friends of the family, receiving advocacy services and counseling, or any of the variety of services we have, like transitional housing or what have you. But in what ways are they connected back to an investigator or back to the police department? And what does that communication look like?
So we have 2 victim service counselors here that will reach out to them throughout the time of the investigation that will help continue coordinating those services, but also coordinating with the investigators. A lot of times investigators are moving pretty rapidly on working a number of cases. So then making the phone calls back, you can sometimes have a period of gaps. So we're trying to close that.
Gotcha. And that, you know, Sergeant Baker, you talked about how Denton PD is one of the bigger PDs with more resources. I know that both the Colony and Aubrey PD don't have a designated victim liaison that is actively working with your criminal investigators in following up with victims. What does that look like for y'all when you're trying to get back in touch with victims or keeping them informed?
Well, one of the things that we do is we try to, we stress to our detectives to stay in contact. We really want them to, we don't want our victims to fall through where they feel like they've been neglected or feel that they're not being heard. So I really try to push our people to really to be that go-between. We are growing, we are busy, and that does still happen where we don't have as much contact as I think our victims want. But thankfully, because we have such a good working relationship with friends of the family and your advocates, oftentimes when the victim starts to feel a little bit, where she hadn't heard from a detective, they'll get with the advocate, and the advocate will then contact us, and we have no issues with talking with them. And it kind of, your advocates help to fill that piece that we're missing just from a lack of resources on our end.
Lieutenant, anything to add to that?
Just, I make sure that all the victims have my phone number, my cell number and email, and are encouraged to contact me should they need anything whatsoever.
I appreciate that. I know that that ability to reach out is just as important as doing so. We are down to our last minute. I want to take that time to say a huge thank you to the three of you for taking an hour out of your day to be on this Facebook Live and this Zoom meeting with me. But even more so of the ways that you are actively working in your community and within your own departments to drive change and to bring awareness to family violence and just how important those cases are. And I think that I can very clearly speak on behalf of Friends of the Family that we value you and that partnership so much. And also happy Law Enforcement Week to each of you.
Thank you, Lori.
Anything that y'all would like to say to the community in your last 30 seconds?
Sum it up, Chief.
Oh, yeah, okay. So, I just want to tell everybody in the community, thank you so much. You don't really understand how special law enforcement community up here in North Texas, specifically in the Metroplex and in Dayton County is. We work very well together. There is so much collaboration going on, both out front and behind the scenes. And we are truly being patrolled and protected by some of the greatest men and women in this profession. So thank all of you for your support. Thank you to you guys, Lori. We couldn't do it without you.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much
Appreciate
for
it.
joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.